I thought the neighbor's kid was playing a prank with a mirror, until I realized the reflection in my backyard was moving 3 seconds faster than I was. The silence of rural Ohio isn't actually silent. It's a heavy, vibrating hum of cicadas and wind through corn husks. But that Tuesday, at exactly 11:14 p.m., the hum stopped. I was standing on my back porch, the amber glow of the bug light casting long, sickly shadows across the lawn. I'd lived here 6 months, and I'd never seen the woods at the edge of my property look so solid. It wasn't just darkness. It was as if someone had hung a black velvet curtain between the oaks. And then, the motion light clicked on. Not by the house, by the shed. The sharp clack of a plastic sensor, followed by the hum of a halogen bulb. I froze. There was nothing there. Just my old John Deere and a stack of firewood. Stupid rabbits, I muttered, but my breath hitched. My inner voice, the one that keeps me alive, was screaming that rabbits don't trigger sensors 6 feet off the ground. I stepped down onto the grass. The dew was cold, soaking into my socks. I should have gone inside. I should have locked the sliding door and turned on every light in the kitchen. Instead, I walked toward the shed. Soft, wet footsteps on grass. The distant, rhythmic hoo-hoo of an owl that abruptly cuts off. As I got closer, I noticed something tucked into the tall grass near the property line. It was a fence post, but I hadn't put it there. It was a jagged piece of gray wood, and tied to it with rusted wire was a Polaroid photo. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The image was of my back porch, taken from the woods. In the photo, I was standing exactly where I had been 2 minutes ago, looking at the shed. But in the photo, there was a man standing directly behind me. A tall, thin shape with arms that seemed a few inches too long, his hand hovering just an inch from my neck. "What the hell?" I whispered. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I spun around, swinging my flashlight toward the porch. Empty. Then I heard it. A slow, rhythmic scraping sound, like a fingernail dragging across a window screen. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from under the porch. I didn't run. I couldn't. I felt like I was moving through waist-deep water. I walked back toward the house, my eyes fixed on the dark gap beneath the wooden slats of the deck. I knelt down, the flashlight beam cutting through the cobwebs. 2 eyes reflected back, pale, unblinking, and spaced too far apart for a human. "Get off my property," I croaked, my voice breaking. The thing didn't move. It spoke, but it didn't use its own voice. It used mine. "Get off my property," it repeated, perfectly mimicking my exact pitch, my exact tremor. I scrambled backward, falling onto the grass. I bolted for the back door, slid it open, and slammed it shut, locking every bolt. I leaned against the glass, gasping for air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my neighbor, Miller, who lived a half-mile down the road. "Hey, buddy, you okay? I'm looking through my binoculars at your backyard. Why are there 2 of you standing on the porch looking at each other?" I looked at the glass. I wasn't looking at a reflection. The thing was standing on the other side of the glass, wearing my face, mimicking my terrified expression, and slowly, very slowly, it raised its hand to the lock. In the suburbs of Surrey, we don't worry about wolves. We worry about the things that scream like women in the garden at 3 a.m. You haven't known true unease until you've heard a vixen scream in the middle of a British night. It sounds like a woman being murdered in the shrubbery. You get used to it after a while. You tell yourself, it's just nature. It's just a fox. But what do you do when the screaming starts coming from the baby monitor, and your daughter's bedroom window overlooks the perfectly manicured garden where nothing is supposed to be? Static crackle of a baby monitor. A high-pitched, curdling shriek that fades into a low, sobbing moan. I sat up in bed, the duvet tangled around my legs. My wife, Sarah, didn't wake. She could sleep through a blitz. I grabbed the monitor. "Maya," I whispered. No response, just the sound of a window sliding open. Creak. I was out of bed in a second. I ran down the hall to Maya's room. The door was ajar. The curtains were billowing in the damp, midnight air. The window was wide open, but Maya was tucked in her bed, fast asleep. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Christ," I muttered. I went to close the window, looking out over our garden. We'd spent $3,000 on the landscaping, high hedges, a stone path, and a small decorative pond. In the center of the lawn, there was a hole. It wasn't a fox den. It was a perfect, geometric square, about 4 feet wide. The dirt was piled neatly to the side, as if someone had used a spirit level. The sound of a spade hitting hard clay, thwack, slide, thwacked. I looked down. At the edge of the hole stood a figure. It was wearing a high-visibility vest, like a council worker. It was digging. "Excuse me," I shouted, my voice echoing off the neighboring brick houses. "What the bloody hell are you doing in my garden?" The figure stopped. It didn't look up. It just pointed into the hole. I felt a cold sweat prickle my scalp. I grabbed my heavy mag light and ran downstairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door. The air felt unnaturally cold, smelling of wet earth and something metallic, like old coins. "I'm calling the police," I yelled, stepping onto the grass. The figure in the vest was gone. The spade was lying on the ground. I walked to the edge of the square hole. I shone the light down. It wasn't a grave. It was a shaft, lined with concrete, leading down into a ladder. And at the bottom, 30 feet down, was a room. A room that looked exactly like my living room. Same sofa, same TV, same picture of Sarah and me on the mantle. The sound of a heavy metal bolt sliding into place behind the listener. I heard a movement behind me. I turned, and there was the man in the vest. He wasn't a council worker. He had no face, just a smooth, fleshy surface where features should be. He didn't attack me. He simply handed me the spade. Then, from the house behind me, my house, I heard the back door open. I saw myself walk out. The me from the house looked at the me, standing by the hole with utter confusion and horror. "Excuse me," the other me shouted from the porch. "What the bloody hell are you doing in my garden?" I looked at the spade. I looked at the faceless man, and I realized with a sickening jolt, I wasn't the owner anymore. I was the gardener, and it was time to finish the room downstairs. I thought the neighbor's cat was tripping my security lights, until I realized the shadows were moving toward the house, not away from it. The app on my phone chirped at 3:12 a.m. Motion detected in backyard. I groaned, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, thinking it was just another stray cat or a particularly heavy gust of wind hitting the chimes. But when I opened the live feed, the yard was empty, just the silver grass under the floodlights. Then, the light clicked off. 5 seconds later, it clicked back on. Something was standing directly under the camera, looking up. The low, digital boop of a smartphone notification followed by the hum of a security camera pivoting. I stared at the screen. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of one. He was wearing a weathered raincoat, despite the dry Georgia heat. He didn't move. He just stood there, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. "Hey, I can see you," I shouted into the two-way audio. My voice sounded thin and tinny through the outdoor speaker. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, handheld mirror. He angled it perfectly so that the reflection showed my own bedroom window, the one right behind my head. The sharp, rhythmic tapping of a finger against glass. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I watched the screen. In the mirror the man held, I saw a hand, pale, long-fingered, slowly sliding my bedroom window upward. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the heavy lamp from the nightstand. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glowing screen of my phone on the mattress. "Get out!" I screamed, swinging the lamp at the shadows by the window. The curtains fluttered. The window was locked. It hadn't been moved. I looked back at the phone. The man in the backyard was gone. The yard was pitch black again, but the app chirped one last time. Motion detected in hallway. I looked at the bedroom door. The handle began to turn, slow and deliberate. A text message popped up on my screen from an unknown number. "The mirror doesn't show the past, Caleb. It shows the invitation. Thanks for letting me in." The door creaked open, and the smell of wet raincoat filled the room. My grandfather always told me never to go into the greenhouse after sunset, but I never expected to find his pulse coming from the soil. Old glass has a way of distorting things. In the back of my new cottage in Norfolk, there's a Victorian greenhouse that should have been torn down decades ago. The panes are yellowed and bubbled. Last night, as the fog rolled in from the coast, I saw my wife through the glass, tending to the ferns. The only problem? My wife died 3 years ago, and she wasn't buried in a cemetery. The muffled clink of ceramic pots and the wet, heavy thud of a shovel hitting peat moss. I stood at the kitchen window, paralyzed. The figure in the greenhouse was wearing her favorite green cardigan. She was humming, a low, melodic tune that vibrated in my very marrow. "It's the grief," I whispered to the empty kitchen. "Just a trick of the light." But then the figure turned. Through the distorted glass, her face looked like a smeared oil painting. She waved, a slow, stiff movement of the arm. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the garden. The air was thick with the scent of salt and rotting vegetation. As I approached the greenhouse, the humming stopped, the rhythmic creak groan of a rusted hinge moving in the wind. I pushed the door open. The air inside was stiflingly hot, reaching nearly 30 degrees Celsius despite the October chill outside. The benches were empty. No ferns, no pots, just a single, large mound of fresh black earth in the center of the floor. I stepped closer. The earth was moving. It was rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. "Sarah?" I breathed. The mound of dirt split open. A hand reached out, not a human hand, but a braid of thick, translucent roots shaped like fingers. It gripped my ankle with the strength of a vice. I fell hard, my face hitting the dirt. As I struggled, I saw her. Not Sarah, but a thing made of vines and moss wearing her wedding ring. It leaned over me, its mouth a dark hole filled with damp soil. The garden was lonely. It whispered in a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. I looked toward the house and saw the kitchen light go on. A figure stood at the window, looking out at the greenhouse. It was me. The real me was inside, making tea, completely unaware that the thing under my feet was pulling me down to be the next season's fertilizer. I thought the laughter coming from the old oak tree was just the neighbor's kids, until I remembered the family moved out 3 years ago. The old oak at the edge of my backyard in Oregon is a monster of a tree, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. When we moved in, the real estate agent called the rickety tree house a charming feature. But at 2 a.m., when the moon is thin and the wind dies down, the charm disappears. Last night, the rope ladder, which I had pulled up and tied off weeks ago, was dangling perfectly straight, swaying just an inch off the grass. The rhythmic creak of old wood straining against rusted nails. I stood at the sliding glass door, my breath fogging the pain. I shouldn't have looked. My brain told me it was the wind, but the air was dead still. Then, a light flickered inside the tiny wooden box high in the branches. Not a flashlight, a warm, orange glow, like a candle. "Who's up there?" I whispered, my hand gripping the cold handle of the door. I stepped out into the damp grass. The smell of pine needles was overpowering. As I approached the base of the tree, the laughter started. It wasn't high-pitched or playful. It was a low, melodic giggling that sounded like it was bubbling up through water. Soft, rapid thumping on wooden floorboards above, like small feet running in circles. "This isn't funny," I called out, my voice cracking. "I'm calling the cops." The giggling stopped instantly. A small, pale hand reached out from the treehouse window and dropped something. It fell through the branches with a soft thud onto the mossy ground. I shone my light on it. It was my own wallet, the one I had left on my nightstand right next to my sleeping head 10 minutes ago. I looked up, panicking. The rope ladder began to retract, being pulled up by something with immense strength. I grabbed the bottom rung, desperate to see who was in my house. I climbed, my muscles screaming, until I reached the trapdoor. I pushed it open. The interior was empty of people, but the walls were covered. Thousands of Polaroids were pinned to the wood. Every single one was a photo of me sleeping in my bed, taken from the corner of my ceiling. I heard a floorboard creak behind me, inside the tiny space. I turned my flashlight. There was no child, just a tall, distorted figure crouched in the corner, holding my spare house key between its teeth. It didn't attack. It just pointed back toward my house. I looked through the treehouse telescope, aimed right at my bedroom window. I saw myself. I was still in bed, and the thing with the key was tucking me in. In the Yorkshire Dales, the dry stone walls aren't just for keeping sheep in. They're for keeping the things that live in the fog out. Living on the edge of the moors means accepting that the fog owns the land half the year. My backyard ends where the ancient stone wall begins, a gray, crumbling boundary between my garden and miles of empty heather. But tonight, the boundary moved. I looked out my kitchen window, and the wall was 10 feet closer to the house than it was at breakfast. The heavy, grinding sound of stone sliding against stone, thud. I rubbed my eyes. I've lived in this cottage for a decade. I know every inch of that yard. I grabbed my torch and stepped out. The fog was like wet wool, sticking to my skin. I walked to where the wall usually stood. The grass was torn up, great dark gashes in the earth where the heavy boulders had been dragged forward. Is someone there? I shouted. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I reached out to touch the stones. They were warm. Not sitting in the sun warm, they felt like skin. I could feel a faint, rhythmic pulse beneath the moss. A low, subterranean vibration, like a distant engine idling deep underground. I backed away, but my heel hit something solid. I spun around. Another wall had appeared behind me, cutting me off from the back door. I was trapped in a 10-foot square of grass that was rapidly shrinking. The walls were sliding inward, inch by inch, grinding the earth beneath them. Help! I screamed, but the fog swallowed the sound. I looked up. The top of the walls weren't flat anymore. They were jagged, beginning to curve inward like teeth. I scrambled to climb over, but the stones were slick with a dark, oily substance. As the space became smaller, a voice whispered from the cracks between the rocks. It wasn't a monster's growl. It was the voice of the man who sold me the house. The land always takes its commission, Mr. Henderson, the stones hissed. The walls slammed together with a bone-crushing force. The next morning, the sun came out over the dales. The backyard was perfectly flat, the stone wall back in its original place at the edge of the moor. The only thing different was a single, new stone in the center of the wall, one that bore a striking resemblance to a human face, frozen in a silent scream. I thought the scratching in the backyard pipe was a trapped alligator, until it started calling me by my childhood nickname. The humidity in the Florida glades doesn't just sit on you, it breathes on you. My backyard ends in a stagnant canal, separated only by a rusted chain-link fence and a massive concrete drainage pipe that gulps down rainwater. Last night, during a tropical downpour, the pipe started coughing. Not water, but hair. Thick, matted clumps of black hair that clogged the grate and smelled like a shallow grave. The heavy, echoing glop, glop of water trapped in a concrete tunnel, followed by a wet, sliding sound. I stood there with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the torrential rain. Something was jammed deep inside the 3-foot-wide pipe. I poked at the hair with a rake, and the pipe hissed. "Get out of there, you scaly bastard," I yelled, thinking it was a stray bull gator. But the sound that came back wasn't a hiss. It was a wet, rhythmic clicking, like someone tapping two stones together deep inside their throat. Rapid, frantic clicking, click, 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 echoing through hollow concrete. I knelt down, the mud soaking into my jeans. I shone the light deeper. There were no scales. I saw a pair of human shoulders, pale and slick, wedged tight against the concrete walls. The person was positioned headfirst, crawling toward my house, not away from it. "Sir, are you stuck?" I reached out a hand. The clicking stopped. A voice, small and muffled by the concrete, whispered, "Is it safe yet, Joey?" I froze. Nobody has called me Joey since my brother disappeared in these woods 20 years ago. My heart felt like it was going to burst. I reached in further, my fingers brushing against cold, clammy skin. "Benny," I gasped. The thing in the pipe surged forward with unnatural speed. Its face hit the light. It wasn't Benny. It was a face made of stitched-together swamp grass and human skin, with empty sockets where eyes should be. Not Benny. It chirped in my brother's exact 7-year-old voice. "Benny's the one who's digging the hole under your bed right now. I'm just the distraction." I heard a sharp crack from the floorboards of my house behind me. I looked back to see a small, muddy hand reach up through a hole in my bedroom floor. We thought burying the trampoline would make the garden look nicer, but we didn't realize we were building a window for the things living beneath us. In-ground trampolines are all the rage in Bristol suburbs. They look sleek and they're safer for the kids. But there's a reason people don't usually dig 6-foot holes in ancient soil. After the first week, my son, Leo, stopped jumping. He would just stand in the center of the black mat, staring down at his feet, whispering to the fabric. When I asked him what he was doing, he said, The man underneath is tired of being stepped on. The rhythmic, metallic squeak of rusted trampoline springs stretching under a heavy weight. I went out at midnight to check the safety cover. The moon was a pale sliver over the hedges. As I stepped onto the black mat, it felt wrong. It didn't have the usual spring. It felt heavy, as if the air pressure in the hole beneath it had increased tenfold. Suddenly, the mat dipped. Hard. A deep, guttural oomph of air being forced out of a large pair of lungs. Something was pushing up from below. I could see the silhouette of a massive, wide hand pressed against the underside of the fabric, right between my feet. It was easily twice the size of a human hand. "Leo, if this is a prank, it's not funny," I said, though I knew my son was asleep inside. The hand moved. It began to stroke the bottom of the mat, tracing the outline of my shoes. Then, the fabric began to tear. Not from the weight, but from something sharp, like a claw, slicing slowly through the heavy-duty mesh. I tried to jump off, but the mat became sticky, like wet tar. I was sinking into it. The more I struggled, the more the springs groaned. I looked down through the widening tear in the fabric. I expected to see a monster. Instead, I saw a mirror image of my own garden, but inverted. A sky of churning gray dirt and a house that looked like mine, but rotted. Standing in that underground garden was my son, Leo. But he was looking up at me with eyes that were solid black. "He's not tired of being stepped on anymore, Dad," the boy from the hole whispered. "He wants to be the one doing the stepping." The mat gave way. As I fell into the dark, cold earth, I looked up and saw a giant version of my son's foot descending from the sky to crush the life out of me. I thought moving the ceramic gnome was my wife's way of teasing me, until I found it sitting on my chest in the middle of a sleep paralysis episode. In the rocky soil of coastal Maine, things stay buried for a reason. When I bought this house, there was a single, weather-beaten garden gnome tucked under the porch. It was ugly, chipped red hat, a jagged grin, and eyes that seemed to track the sun. I threw it in the trash on Monday. On Tuesday morning, it was back under the porch. By Wednesday, it was sitting on the top step of the deck, facing the glass door. The heavy, ceramic clink of stone hitting wood, followed by the dry sound of something dragging across a porch. I locked the sliding door and pulled the heavy curtains. "Funny, Sarah," I muttered, but my wife was in Portland for the week. I was alone. I sat on the sofa, trying to focus on the TV, but I kept hearing it. A tiny, rhythmic thump drag on the wooden slats outside. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy brick, 1 inch at a time. I checked the security camera. The porch was empty. I panned the camera down to the stairs. The gnome was gone. A sharp, sudden tink, the sound of a pebble hitting a window pane. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I crept to the kitchen window and peeked through the blinds. The gnome wasn't on the porch anymore. It was in the middle of the yard, but it looked bigger. Its ceramic skin was cracking, and through the cracks, I saw something wet and pulsing. "Go away," I yelled. The gnome didn't move, but its shadow did. The sun was down, the only light coming from the moon, yet the gnome's shadow was stretching toward the house, moving independently of the light source. It slid across the grass like spilled ink, climbing up the siding of the house. I ran to the front door, but the handle wouldn't turn. It felt like it had been fused shut. I looked back at the sliding glass door. The shadow had reached the glass. Suddenly, the ceramic shell of the gnome in the yard shattered. Out crawled a gray, shriveled thing with limbs like knotted roots. It didn't run. It simply stepped into its own shadow. I felt a weight on my shoulders. I looked in the hallway mirror. The creature wasn't in the room with me, but its shadow was wrapped around my neck, squeezing. I looked back at the yard. The ceramic gnome was back, perfectly whole, sitting on the grass. But this time, its painted face had changed. It wasn't grinning anymore. It was wearing my expression of pure, suffocating terror. The new automated sprinklers were supposed to keep the lawn green, but at 3 a.m., they started spraying something that smelled like iron and old copper. There is a specific rhythm to a suburban UK summer: the hum of lawnmowers, the smell of charcoal, and the mechanical tch of sprinklers. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was obsessed with his lawn. When he passed away last month, the yard went to seed. But last night, at exactly 3:03 a.m., his old rusted sprinkler system hissed to life. Only, it wasn't watering the grass. It was watering the fence. My fence. The rhythmic, metallic tch 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 of a rotating sprinkler head, followed by a wet, heavy splashing sound. I looked out the bedroom window. The liquid hitting the wood wasn't clear. In the moonlight, it looked dark, almost black. The smell hit me a second later, thick, metallic, and sickly sweet. Bloody hell, I whispered, pulling on my dressing gown. I went out the back door, the grass crunching under my slippers. As I got closer to the fence, I realized the liquid was warm. It was steaming in the cool night air. I touched the wood, and my hand came away stained a deep, visceral crimson. "Henderson," I called out over the fence. The clicking stopped. The sound of a heavy, wet sack being dragged over gravel. I climbed a small stepladder to peek over the fence into Henderson's yard. The lawn was gone. In its place was a massive, open trench. The sprinkler wasn't connected to a hose. The pipe went straight down into the trench, and as the pump hissed, I saw where the fluid was coming from. The trench was filled with people. The entire neighborhood, the postman, the lady from the corner shop, even the milkman, were standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud, their mouths open, staring up at the sky. The sprinkler head sat in the center of them. It wasn't pumping water, it was acting as a vacuum, siphoning the very life out of them to keep the grass on my side of the fence green. I looked down at my own feet. The grass I was standing on wasn't green because of the rain. It was green because it was feeding on me. I tried to move, but my slippers were rooted to the soil. My skin began to pale as the tch started again, and I felt the first cold copper spray hit the back of my neck.